All righty, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody to our final seminar of the semester. This week, we are extremely lucky to have Catrina Doxsee to come speak to us from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Over this past semester, we've had an interesting set of speakers. We've had some academics. We are fortunate enough to have Aisha from DOJ to come speak with us. And today we sort of rounded out with Catrina, who's coming from an NGO, and I think provides a very interesting perspective and different perspective than what we've seen previously. So Catrina is the program manager and research associate for the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. There she analyzes international and domestic terrorism and the irregular activities of countries like Iran, Russia, and China. Prior to joining CSIS, she worked as an associate policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute. Ms. Doxsee has conducted research at the Philip Murrell Center for Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins, the Johns Hopkins University, and the U.S. Treasury's Department Middle East and North Africa office. She previously served for 2 years in AmeriCorps as a refugee resettlement caseworker in Pittsburgh. Outside of CSIS, she is an editorial board member for the Irregular Warfare Initiative at the Modern War Institute at West Point. Ms. Doxsee holds a BA in history with a concentration in military history from the University of Chicago and an MA in strategic studies and international economics from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So in about a second, I'm going to pass it off to Catrina to take over. But before we do that, I want to acknowledge the support of DHS in this seminar series, but then sort of follow up and say anything that's said here should not be viewed as the opinions or conclusions or interpretations or policies of DHS, and certainly that holds true for UCF as well. So general disclaimer. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Catrina to start her presentation.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for being here today. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. Yeah, so thank you for that great introduction. So again, I'm working with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in the Transnational Threats Project. So we are a nonprofit bipartisan think tank, and the Transnational Threats Project in particular does policy relevant research looking at the activity of international and domestic terrorist networks, as well as the irregular activities of countries such as Russia, Iran, and China. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I'm going to run through the presentation, but then I want to leave plenty of time at the end for questions and really turn this into a discussion, talking through our data. So just to give you a sense of where we'll be going today, I'm just going to start out by giving you the definitions that we use in this analysis. As most of you probably know, even the definition of the word terrorism, let alone getting into different ideologies, is often debated. So just laying the groundwork of what we mean when we say different things. And then I'll just give you an overview of how we built the data set that underpins the work that I'm going to be talking about today. And then a sense of our analysis of incidents being terrorist attacks and plots, and fatalities over time. As well as in our latest analysis, we looked specifically at connections to military and police personnel. So that's both in terms of perpetrator affiliations, but also targeting of military, police, and other government facilities. So then finally, I'll just end on a few policy and research implications that we can draw from this data, and things to think about moving forward, both for government action and also where there continue to be gaps in the research. So just to start us out here, when I talk about terrorism, what we at CSIS mean by that is the deliberate use or threat of violence by non-state actors to achieve a political goal and to create a broader psychological impact. And so when we talk about different incidents that we code in the data set or different things that we analyze, in order to be included in our analysis, an event, whether it's a plot or an attack, must meet all components of this definition. Then similarly, I won't go through and read all of this slide, but this is how we break out different ideologies when we talk about coding perpetrator orientations. So the 5 main categories that we used in this analysis include far right terrorism, far left terrorism, religious terrorism. And I should note that while we have the broad definition here of the use of violence as defined in the definition of terrorism in support of a faith-based system, all of the events in the CSIS data set in the United States in the time period we're looking at, which is since 1994, all of the events coded as religious terrorism were committed by perpetrators following a Salafi jihadist ideology. And so you'll see at some points in our analysis, those two terms are used interchangeably. There's ethno-nationalist terrorism, which we see very little of in the United States, but we see a lot more abroad. And then finally, the 5th category not listed on here, we have an other category. So that's people who are motivated more by a single policy issue that they're concerned about, or more broadly, other ideologies that don't fit neatly into one of these categories. So what do some of these big actors look like in the United States? Just to give a couple of examples. We're seeing the biggest threat, and I'll get into this in a few moments in looking at the level of attacks and plots, but a lot of threat coming from white supremacists and other anti-government groups. So most of these fall into that far right bucket that we just talked about on the previous slide. So this may include more organized groups or networks. On the white supremacist side, groups like Atomwaffen or the Base. On the anti-government side, the militia movement, including streams like the 3%ers. But it also includes a lot of individual actors, loose networks, small groups, folks who have been radicalized independently. And that's a theme that we're going to continue to see throughout this analysis, is that even though domestic terrorist activity is increasing in the United States, the biggest threat we're seeing at this point isn't coming from these centralized cohesive groups. It's really coming from loose networks, individuals, and small groups. And that's part of what makes it so difficult to counter. In terms of other ideologies, though smaller, we do see extremism on the far left, including anarchist activity, violent anti-fascists, as well as over time through the time period, less so today, but particularly in the late 90s and the early 2000s, a lot of far left activity from violent animal rights activists or violent environmentalists. And then finally, as I mentioned, the main religious terrorist threat in the United States comes from individuals with a Salafi jihadist ideology inspired by groups like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. And so to move into the data set that we've compiled. So TNT has put together a data set of 980 incidents, both attacks and plots, from 1994 now through the end of January 2021 in our latest update. And so we're looking at attacks and plots that occurred in or were planned against the United States, which we're defining as the 50 states, DC, and Puerto Rico. So as you'll see listed out here, we drew from a variety of sources, including various other data sets and databases that compile political violence. We drew from the Department of Justice and the FBI, both some of their annual and longer term reports, as well as press releases and other criminal documents. Broadly, we tried to draw from documents in criminal cases, including affidavits where available, as well as cross-referencing these things against local and national news sources. And so the value add that we think that we have moving into this space, particularly given that there are all of these other great resources as well, is that we really honed down and pulled from these sources cases that meet this definition of terrorism. And so if you think back to that definition of the use or threat of violence, you'll see that it in many cases overlaps with other concerning trends, such as hate crimes. but it's not going to be exact overlap. So unfortunately, many hate crimes do involve violence and therefore may also meet the definition of terrorism, but many also are not violent. So things like graffiti or nonviolent vandalism. Similarly, there are other political events, political trends that we've seen that some of these sources have tracked really well, including particularly in the past year, protests or riots. However, a lot of those also do not meet the definition of terrorism, and that doesn't really fit the bounds of what we're setting out to analyze, particularly looking at the fact that the vast majority of protests in the past year were nonviolent, and even in cases where there were riots, often there were non-political motives at play. So for instance, analysis has shown that the vast majority of the looting, for example, was committed by apolitical, opportunistic criminals rather than individuals with a political motive. So we drew out, even from these really complicated events, a pretty high standard of evidence for identifying events where we had a clear political motive, and we clearly met all components of that definition of terrorism. So just to give a brief snapshot before we go into the findings of our analysis of some of the characteristics that we track in the data set. So we evaluate both characteristics of the event and of the perpetrator. So you'll see them listed out here, along with the basics of when and where an attack or a plot took place. We do specify whether it was an attack or a plot for nuance in the analysis. And you'll see as we go through, we also track the target, the weapon, fatalities. You'll see that we kind of switch out some of those as filters for our analysis. So for instance, when we talk about targets, we often talk about targets only of events that are coded as attacks rather than plots, because plots don't always have a concretely identified target. The plot may not have been far enough along when it was foiled to have a clear sense of who or what would be targeted, or in many cases, you have intercepted lists of maybe 10 possible targets that were under consideration, but no clear sense of who the attackers were actually going to attack. In terms of perpetrator characteristics, as I mentioned, and as we went through those definitions, we also code out the ideology. The group, if there is one, as I mentioned, we're seeing a lot of activity, particularly coming from radicalized individuals or loose networks, people who adhere to an ideology, particularly those who have found community and radicalization pathways online rather than through some kind of centralized hub and real order for a formal membership group. And in our latest iteration of the data set, we also added in variables tracking the affiliation of perpetrators with either law enforcement agencies or the military. And so the way we coded that out, and that's going to come into play later in this analysis, is that we first coded whether or not there was an affiliation with each of these groups. And so that's coded yes, no, or unknown. And then if there was an affiliation for law enforcement, we coded whether it was current, so if they were active law enforcement officers, or former. For military, if they were active reserve or veterans. And so for the military in particular, this status distinction is really important. And you'll see as we get later in the analysis, we talk a lot specifically about active and reserve service members. And that's because under the Military Code of Justice, there are different resources and different pathways available in order to hold individuals accountable depending on what their status is. So active duty service members are fully able to be held accountable under the Uniform Military Code of Justice. Reserve members are only accountable for time when they are on duty. Their time off duty, the military does not have the same level of authority over them. Now, veterans are the most outside of DoD's direct control in terms of bringing any kind of disciplinary action against them. However, some researchers have suggested that there may be recourses available to the military, including things like retroactive demotions or things that might affect their pensions. So now getting into the analysis itself, what we've all been waiting for. So in this chart, we map out the number of attacks and plots in the entire span of the data set, dating back to 1994. And as you can see, we are seeing a really concerning trend. So in 2020, there were 110 attacks and plots on record, which is the highest that we've seen during the entire span of this data set, so dating back to at least 1994. Of those, if we break it out by ideology, 66%, so 2/3, were coming from far-right actors, and 23% were coming from violent far-left actors. So overwhelmingly, the greatest threat is coming from the violent far-right, which includes groups like white supremacists, anti-government extremists. But there's also a growing threat from the far left as well. So even though it's only 23%, that's actually a notable increase. So over the past 3 years prior to 2020, the percentage attributed to far left actors ranged from 5 to 11%. So that's a pretty big jump upwards. Now, notably, in contrast to these far left and far right actors who are acting more with domestic political motives, we're seeing a notable decrease in the amount of religious attacks and plots. So again, these are from individuals inspired by Salafi jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. So in 2020, the percentage of plots from religious actors was down to 5%, which is extremely low. And this, we think, we'll get into this more in the policy implication section, but this really points to the fact that the greatest threat in the United States is at this point coming from actors with domestic political and social motives rather than Salafi jihadist terrorists, which has really been the focus of US counterterrorism efforts, including the allocation of personnel and resources since 9/11. Now, moving on to just juxtaposing this information about attacks and plots with fatalities. Even though, as I just mentioned, we are seeing the greatest number of attacks and plots during the entire span of this data set, we actually saw a notable decrease in fatalities in 2020. So we only had 5 fatalities. Those were coming from 5 discrete attacks, each of which the weapon used was a firearm, and there was 1 victim killed. And so overall, this is a somewhat less worrying trend. We have a few different thoughts on why this could be happening, but I think it's also really notable that this could easily reverse at a moment's notice. And again, this data goes through the end of January 2021. We don't include any of the recent mass shootings, nor do we necessarily have enough information at this point in time to judge whether any of those qualify under the definition of terrorism, or if there's broader mass casualty events and mass shooter events. So that does not play into this analysis. But in 2020, we had only 5 fatalities, and this was the lowest level of fatalities since 2013. So some of the thoughts behind this, there were a lot of foiled plots in 2020. And so, in some of these cases, it may just be that law enforcement's really doing its job. And so we've been able to prevent many events which could have been extremely tragic, even more tragic than the events that we already saw in 2020. Another thing to keep in mind is that, again, the 5 fatalities in 2020 came from 5 discrete attacks. And so we didn't see any mass casualty terrorist attacks in 2020, as opposed to previous years in which we had attacks such as the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, or the shooting at the Walmart in El Paso. And so this is something that easily could be reversed if there were a large scale killing such as those. But finally, another kind of force that could be behind this decrease in fatalities is a sense of restraint on the part of perpetrators. So again, as we mentioned, terrorism is meant to really send a political message and to achieve a political goal. And so it could be the case that we're seeing a trend toward using restraint to send a message through terrorism through the threat of violence or through the use of violence to convey this psychological panic and worry and confusion, but without the goal being necessarily to inflict as many fatalities as possible. And so this is, we think, potentially likely, given that there was no shortage of opportunities for more lethal attacks in 2020, particularly with the large number of mass demonstrations that we saw. And when we get into targets, we did see a lot of attacks that targeted demonstrators specifically. But we saw a lot of attacks, again, targeting demonstrators, targeting private individuals. So no shortage of soft targets. And so especially with terrorist activity at the highest level throughout this time period, it really is surprising, though lucky, that we didn't see as many fatalities. So now, as I mentioned, our added variables that we put into this latest update of our data set are tracking military and law enforcement affiliation. So there's been growing concern over extremism in the ranks that's really been driven forward by the events of January 6th at the Capitol. And so as you'll see here, there have been several law enforcement officers, four current and 3 former officers who have been brought up on federal charges. On the military side, at least 1 reservist, 1 member of the National Guard, and 31 or more veterans who have been brought up on federal charges. And so there's been this sharp turn to investigate the level of extremism in the military and in law enforcement and what can be done to counter it. The Department of Defense has already begun taking action, including initiating an internal review and ordering the 1-day stand down within all units to address issues of extremism. And other efforts are ongoing to continue to come up with plans to counter extremism. And so we set out here not to try to measure the level of extremism in the military or in law enforcement, because that's something that is much harder to quantify, especially given the level of data that these institutions track and make publicly available. But what we were able to do was to evaluate, of the attacks and plots that we track, what number or what percentage were committed by individuals who are affiliated with either the military or law enforcement. And so what we found was that in recent years and in 2020, there was an increase in the percentage of attacks and plots that we were tracking that had at least 1 perpetrator who was either an active duty or reserve service member. And so as you'll see here, in 2020, that overall percentage of both active duty and reserve rose to 6.4%, up from 1.5% in 2019, none in 2018, and 2.9 in 2017. And so, again, this is not meant to project the percentage of the military overall that harbors extremist views. And these individuals, as a percentage of the millions of service members overall, make up a tiny fraction of a percent. What we're seeking to do, though, is to figure out what portion of the attacks and plots that we're seeing in the United States have perpetrators with this background. And that's particularly important because we're seeing extremist groups make a concerted effort to recruit members of law enforcement or the military, including veterans, because of the specific value add that they bring to groups, including specialized knowledge, specialized training, including tactical training, in some cases, access to weapons or explosives, and even just broader organizational knowledge that makes them better at planning and executing operations than members of the general public. And so while these individuals make up a tiny percentage of the military overall, this is a really concerning trend just in terms of the portion of extremist activity that is able to draw from their experiences. So now just a few examples of these from 2020. In June 2020, Army Private Ethan Melzer was arrested and charged with providing information on his unit to an occult neo-Nazi and white supremacist organization known as the Order of the Nine Angles. And on the reserve side, in May 2020, Andrew Lynham, who was an Army reservist, was arrested alongside Stephen Parshall and William Loomis, who are both veterans of the Navy and Air Force, respectively. All three are self-identified Boogaloo Boys, the Boogaloo movement being an anti-government extremist movement seeking to bring about a second civil war, which they refer to as the Boogaloo. And so they were arrested in Las Vegas and charged after being found with Molotov cocktails and planning an attack either against a federal building or a power substation, specifically using the protests in response to the murder of George Floyd as cover for their activities and taking advantage of the chaos that they were hoping would ensue to carry out their attack and further this goal of starting a second civil war. So now, this is a double-edged sword, though, because we also found in looking at the targeting data affiliated or attached to attacks and plots in 2020 that there were a large number of incidents that targeted government, military, and police institutions and personnel. So across ideologies, these targets were the most frequent in 2020. 34 out of 89 attacks. Again, this is just looking at attacks, not including foiled plots where we don't always know the concrete target that was going to be chosen. But 34 out of 89 attacks, that's 38% of all attacks in 2020 targeted government, military, and police. So this was the second highest percentage targeting these institutions since 1994, with the only year with a higher percentage being in 2013, when 46% targeted government, military, and police. And so we're seeing this from across the ideological spectrum. So from violent far right, far left, Salafi jihadist terrorists, and others, including the Boogaloo movement. And so even as they continue to examine the prevalence of extremism in their ranks, law enforcement, the military, and other government personnel need to be attentive to the fact that they are continuing to be the target of this violence as well. And this perhaps can even be leveraged to frame training that they give to their personnel, which we'll talk about a little bit later, so that it's less of an accusatory attack, but more of a working together as a team to solidify the safety of these institutions, which includes rooting out insider threats. So a couple examples of this, and both of these occurred in May of 2020. So first, we have the murder of Pat Underwood, who was a protective security officer by Stephen Carrillo, who actually also overlapping with the military affiliation was an Air Force staff sergeant. And then we also had in May 2020 an attack at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi by Adam Alim Al-Sali. And so this in this attack, he drove his car into the barricades at the gate and then opened fire on a security guard at the Naval Air Station. And so these are just a couple incidents over the past year. Out of those, again, 34 attacks targeting government, military, and police. So what do we do about all of this? I think overwhelmingly, the biggest takeaway that we have from going through this data and seeing how much it can illuminate in terms of the targets, the perpetrators, and the risks that we're facing from domestic terrorism is that it's very concerning that the US government does not currently publicly track and analyze data on the domestic terrorist threat, including information on domestic terrorist attacks and plots and on the perpetrators. And so we highly recommend that the government begins to do this as a centralized effort and as a cross-agency effort, especially in this highly politicized climate. Being able to use data to drive the way that domestic terrorism resources are distributed, the way that training is provided, and the way that we focus our counter-extremism efforts is going to allow us to counter what we see as the demonstrated greatest threats without provoking as many partisan accusations or without creating authorities that open the possibility of partisan abuse in the future. So again, I should have stated in the beginning, when we talk especially about far left or far right terrorist networks, that in no way correlates to the mainstream political parties in the United States. That's just terminology used in the terrorism studies field. And so I think that making that very clear, both to lawmakers across the political spectrum and to the general public, making that clear and making data available, making the analysis available, is going to make it clearer that we're all working together towards a common goal of keeping the American people and the American homeland safe from extremism, no matter how it manifests. Second, and this is particularly looking at implications for DoD and for the military, as well as law enforcement, there is a really strong need to address extremism and terrorism across different phases of involvement in the military or in the police. Now, this starts with reform of the clearance process, both during the initial recruitment period and also while clearances are being re-upped. And not only should this process be strengthened to be able to root out extremists, but any changes to this process should be very transparent. It should be clear that the process is being strengthened to counter extremism, because this will also deter some extremist networks from trying to join the military in the first place. We've seen evidence that not only are extremists trying to recruit current or former members of the military or law enforcement, but some of them have even tried to insert their own already radicalized members into these institutions in order to gain the sort of training, knowledge, or to be able to subvert efforts from the inside. And so anything we can do to stop them from doing so and to deter them from doing so will strengthen our institutions. Additionally, for those who are already in the military or law enforcement, there needs to be a greater focus on in-depth anti-extremism training. And so the recent stand-down order was a good first step, but this needs to be an ongoing training and education process. And this includes some of the more subtle signs that people might see. One of the really concerning things that we've seen, particularly in the wake of January 6th, is that some of the individuals who were arrested, including one in particular who was a contractor holding a current security clearance, when they spoke to others in his unit, it was pretty widely acknowledged that he harbored some extremist views. And so there needs to be clear training processes so that individuals can recognize warning signs in their unit, whether it's offhanded comments or supposed jokes that someone makes, symbols on their apparel or on tattoos. And there need to be clear reporting processes and oversight processes so that any of these concerns can be raised to a higher authority. And if it's a severe situation, there are certainly higher level disciplinary measures that can be taken. But this is also a chance to sort of catch people in that gray area where they may be starting to radicalize, they may be starting to be swayed by extremist material or disinformation, particularly with the prevalence of disinformation online. And so this really open process of reporting and raising concerns could also trigger things like counseling processes and interventions to prevent full radicalization, rather than just being a question of discipline or even dismissal. Third, we recommend increased cross-agency coordination, especially when dealing with issues related to veterans. So I talked earlier a lot about active duty and reserve service members, but we're actually, in terms of military affiliated individuals, we're seeing the highest percentage of attacks and plots that are being committed by veterans, including 10% of all attacks and plots in recent years. And so this is a stickier area to try to dig into deeper analysis, just because we don't have publicly available records to be able to judge things like how long ago someone separated from the service, how they left. Were they kicked out? Did they serve with great honors? So depending on that, if a lot of these extremists were kicked out of the military because of their extremist views, that tells us processes are working. If they were never picked up or detected, that tells us that a process has failed along the way. There are also, of course, really strong differences in policy implications. If a lot of these veterans, say, served in the Vietnam era versus having separated within the past couple of years. And so the Department of Defense and the VA have access to a lot of this information. And so we recommend increased cross-agency coordination to collaborate on pulling this data together. And this could be agency initiated or congressionally mandated and overseen. But they should pull together this data. They should run an analysis to really see what the greatest risk factors here are for involvement, and think about ways to leverage veterans groups, both the VA and more informal veteran-focused communities, to be able to detect and counter extremism or to disrupt radicalization pathways. And then finally, even as we continue these efforts to root out extremism in the forces, whether that's military or law enforcement, we should also continue this targeting of, or we should expect this targeting of government, military, and law enforcement targets to continue. We've seen it, again, as I mentioned, rise to the second highest level since the data set began in 1994, since at least 1994, nearly 3 decades. And especially with the high level of extremist activity in the United States right now, and particularly coming from far-right actors, including a lot of anti-government extremists, we see a lot of potential for them to continue this activity and continue targeting government institutions and personnel, particularly if certain policies are proposed or enacted that they view as an existential threat. So some of the big risk factors here could include even some of this anti-extremism policy change that we've talked about here to root out extremism. It could include immigration policy, gun control, including the recent discussion from the Biden administration. All of this could provoke further action from these groups, and particularly white supremacist and anti-government groups who really see these policies of the government as an existential threat to their beliefs. So that's where I'm going to wrap that up, and I welcome any questions that you have.
Alrighty, so if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and send it to me in the chat. I think we already got one of our first questions, which I actually have. So I'll go ahead and I think I'll ask it to the best of my ability based on what I see typed in here. Given the distinction you made between the threat of violence versus actual violence, and we're seeing terrorism, sort of transform into these like modern day cross burnings, where there aren't necessarily fatalities. What is the appropriate metric then you think we should be using when we discuss terrorism outside of fatalities?
The metric, sorry, just to clarify, the metric for the threat level, or?
Yeah, I think they're getting, they are, and I think I am as well, as measuring the prevalence and threat level. So, we can talk about risk and intensity, or quantity and intensity, what are the measures that we should be having?
Sure. So I'm just going back here on the slides to the definition for those who want to reference it. So I think that what we've kind of taken as the main proxy for the threat level and the risk environment has been the number of attacks and plots. And I will say too on this that we specifically chose to include disrupted plots as well as attacks that have actually occurred, because any analysis that excludes plots will suffer from some level of selection bias. So for instance, if say there were 100 plots that were planned in a given year. And the FBI is able to detect all of them and stop all of them. It may look like nothing happened, but that's actually telling us that the ecosystem in general is very ripe for action. If any one of those had been missed, then we could potentially have a huge problem on our hands. And so we specifically included plots for that reason, so that we could continue to get a better proxy for activity overall. Though again, we do have the variable that breaks out attacks versus plots so that we can separate them in the analysis where necessary, including if we were to do a deeper dive into the number of plots versus the number of attacks in the analysis. In terms of looking at the number of attacks and plots versus fatalities, and again, I'll just go to that chart here. So of course, on the chart, you see the greatest spikes in fatalities in 1995 and in 2001, looking respectively at the Oklahoma City bombing and 9/11. But beyond that, you'll see that there are often kind of differences in some of the spikes between fatality levels and the overall number of attacks and plots. Really notably, a disparity in trends looking again at 2020 most recently. And I think that the trap you fall into if you look only at fatalities is again how easy it would be for there to be one of these attacks with more fatalities, right? So we've had in 2020 110 attacks and plots, the highest number across the full data set, and yet extremely low number of fatalities, the lowest since 2013. But as we've seen in recent years, that could easily change even with a single mass casualty terrorist attack, a mass shooting. And so I think that we are able to assess the threat environment more from seeing the likelihood that we're going to see a lot of those incidents, some of which may have high fatalities, as opposed to how many of them successfully were extremely lethal. Particularly given that, again, terrorism is political. It's about sending a political message, and it's about instilling fear and creating a coercive force through your action or your threat of action. And so fatalities aren't necessary for coercion, and fatalities aren't necessary to build an environment of fear. And so while I think it's an important part to keep track of, because we obviously want to keep it as minimal or preferably to zero, the overall activity level gives us a better sense of the threat that we're facing.
A quick follow-up, and just this is more of a question for clarification for me. So when we look at events like January 6th, where we had numerous plots that were semi-coordinated, how do we count that? Do we count them as all unique plots, or sort of one massive plot where everybody wink, wink, I know what you're doing, you know what I'm doing type of thing?
Yeah, so this is something that our team went back and forth on a lot as we were first starting to build out this data set. And what we've come to for multi-part incidents, we think of them, is identifying as each line in the data set a broad strain of effort and coordination, whether that's coordination or kind of a broad act, regardless of necessarily the level of intent to coordinate among participants. So for instance, for January 6th, I believe we ended up coding it as two separate, in terms of DC, there were also events in other states and other locations. But in DC, we have the Capitol attack listed as one line for 2021, which is not on this particular graph, just because with only 1 month it distorts things. But we have that listed as one line, and then we have a line for the pipe bombs that were found at the RNC and DNC headquarters. So our rationale there, we actually have a separate data set where we're breaking out all of the different federal cases that are being brought forward against different participants in the January 6th attacks. But there's a lot of nuance and debate that's going into that. For instance, it's unclear if you would necessarily put a blanket statement on every participant. If someone came, they just thought they were there to demonstrate, they personally didn't commit any acts of violence, is that person concretely a terrorist? There were certainly some that meet the definition of terrorism there. So I will clarify that we're not putting that blanket statement on everyone. But the broad act of attacking the Capitol and Capitol staff, including Capitol Police, and trying to disrupt the certification of the election results, largely driven by a variety of conspiracies and anti-government sentiment, conspiracies including QAnon and the broader Stop the Steal environment. We coded that as sort of one course of action that people followed. So this is pretty consistent with what we've done in previous years. For instance, we coded the 9/11 attacks as one line in the data set because even though they took place in different locations, it was part of kind of a coordinated effort with one objective, much like the Capitol attack had the one objective. Similarly, in the early 2000s, we had, this is, I think, a great example for thinking about how much could be distorted if we broke these out into individual lines. In the early 2000s, we had an animal rights extremist organization that conducted a letter campaign in which they sent over 80 letters that were booby-trapped with razors that were allegedly infected with the AIDS virus to researchers across the country who were doing research with non-human primates. And so that, even though it kind of unfolded over the course of a month or so as different letters arrived, it was part of a coordinated campaign with a coordinated singular goal. And so to start breaking things like that into, say, 80 different incidents would really skew the data and skew our assessment of the threat environment.
Great, thank you. All right, so our next question is from Cynthia. So I'm going to ask that she unmute herself and go ahead and ask her question.
Hello. So first of all, I would like to thank you for being here today. This presentation was really, really good. And also I put some information in the chat box about your work if people are more interested in reading more about the CSIS briefs and more about you and something like that. I have a question. It's a little bit about the classification of the attacks and plots. I see that you use like the events characteristics and the perpetrators characteristics. But what else? Like, what else is the attributes? It's only the ones that we are looking at the table. You make like a mix to classify them as left, right, or left extremists or right extremists. How do you do that classification? Like, if it's something looks like it's from QAnon, you already put in one box, or you actually use all the information you have for that attack, for that specific attack?
Yeah, so we have basically this massive document spreadsheet going through all of these different incidents. So I pulled out the most relevant characteristics here. But if you go to the CSIS website and our reports, with each of our reports that we've released on this, we have a methodology and code book that goes through a lot of this in greater detail. So if you're interested in digging into that, I definitely recommend it. In terms of thinking about coding their ideology and orientation, I listed it here as ideology, but we have a variable that's coded as orientation. So that's where we go through and code them based on those definitions that I talked through at the beginning. So violent far right, violent far left, ethno-nationalist, religious, or other. And that's based on in-depth research that our team does into each case. So we also have lines where we're including links to various sources. And so that's where we're really digging into a lot of criminal case documents. We're digging into reports. In some cases, we're digging into perpetrator social media to find expressions of different ideologies. And so when it really comes down to it, if we're not able to have concrete evidence to identify the ideology and the motive behind their attack, that calls into a question whether or not an incident was actually terrorism. So again, terrorism is violence or the threat of violence committed to achieve a political goal and create a broader psychological impact. I apologize that I'm a bit of a broken record, but because terrorism by definition needs that political component, if there's some kind of violent act and we're digging into the perpetrator, we're digging into all of the documents available, including releases from the FBI or the DOJ, we're digging into affidavits, and there's no clear motive, then we're going to err on the side of coding that not as terrorism. And if more information comes out, we can add that case into the data set later. We really regard this as a living and breathing document. And so I've mentioned a few times that we've updated the data set. So if you look into our reports that are all on csis.org, you'll see that we've come out with a few different analyses, and each time it's based on an updated version of the data set, which both includes a longer period of time and more recent events, but also includes just continued honing of the events that we have, including incorporation of new information. And so based on those findings, we can either say that an event wasn't terrorism, or based on the different ideological codings that we have, we kind of find which bucket their ideology fits into.
Okay, I have another question, and this is a little bit out of curiosity. Do you believe that the massive use of social media now to spread like extremist ideologies help it that the number of attacks was so much more frequent, like the attacks are more frequent now than they were before? Or you don't see any relationship between those two topics?
Yeah, I think that the use of social media and the use of internet platforms has definitely been fueling this. I'm not willing to make a direct causal statement, particularly looking at the really sharp rise that we've seen both in 2020 and in previous years, starting the most recent escalation started really around 2014. I won't make a direct causal statement, but I think that it's definitely been a huge boon to extremist groups in terms of spreading propaganda, radicalizing other individuals, and recruitment, coordination, including on encrypted platforms, and particularly recently with the spread of different conspiracy theories, including notably the extremist conspiracy QAnon, including conspiracy theories like these that have really made it into more mainstream social media, and that have begun to spread in channels where extremist content was not previously as prevalent. I think that we're definitely seeing increased radicalization there, but that would require, I think, further study outside the scope of this data analysis to really detect any causation or when exactly that started.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know if any terrorists aren't on social media or engaging in social media. I think that would be more of the rarity. But all right, our next question. Yes.
I should also add, as I mentioned, I think a couple of times, we're really seeing this threat coming from individual actors or small groups, loose networks. And so a lot of that sort of coordination and inspiration is able to take place online in lieu of having kind of a more formalized membership organization that you go to meetings every Friday. And so we're seeing that in terms of online forums where people are falling into these echo chambers of radicalization, and also seeing people take inspiration and lessons from other attacks, including sharing manuals, including tactics. People who are, especially in the case of mass shootings with a political motive, finding manifestos and working off of those, including international influence there, looking at things like the Christchurch shooter, or even some of the recent incel attacks in Canada. There's been a pretty strong link between the perpetrators in terms of inspiration based, especially on manifestos.
Our next question comes from Gregory. So Gregory, go ahead.
So actually first, you brought up the idea of if social media impacted terrorism. And something that you could do to look at that, I think, would be like an interrupted time series analysis. So if you have a hypothesis for what year this intervention occurred, interrupted time series analysis would let you determine if there was an effect from that intervention. But my actual question was about if you looked at considering the first 3 months of 2020 to the first 3 months of other years as sort of an instrument for the effect of COVID-19 on the availability of targets, because I think it's possible that reduction in deaths that we saw was a result of the pandemic situation instead of something about the terrorism itself.
Yeah, we didn't specifically do that in this analysis, but that's definitely something that we could do using the data that we've compiled. I think just, speaking more broadly and qualitatively without having run the direct comparison, there was a lot of speculation, especially early on in the pandemic, about the effects that it would have, if it would decrease attacks, particularly as we were seeing this increase in recent years of attacks targeting private individuals, largely based on racial, ethnic, or religious identities, and including targeting religious institutions. But one thing that we've seen, and you can kind of see it even in the targeting data from 2020, is that there's been this huge increase in targeting of demonstrators. And so that's been both demonstrations around issues like racism and police brutality, also political demonstrations on all sides of the spectrum, things like Stop the Steal rallies as well, including some other kind of less in the news demonstrators, such as demonstrators outside of an abortion clinic in one of the attacks. But across all of this, again, the types of targets available changed, but there were still a lot of soft targets available. And so I think that's something to keep in mind in running that analysis, but that's definitely something that researchers can dive deeper into. And I think it'd be really interesting to look at, especially as we start coming out of the pandemic and as we start looking at how targeting has changed. There's been a really huge focus recently on the uptick in hate crimes against Asian Americans, much of which has been fueled by a lot of the racist language and incendiary comments around COVID-19, blaming it on China and sort of the racist connotations that people bring that to in terms of other Asian Americans. And so I think that there will be a lot of really interesting data analysis that we can do, looking at how these different factors related to COVID-19, both the change in availability of targets, the change in behaviors, and the change in radicalization narratives has impacted extremist behavior.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
All righty, our next question is from Sharmista. I'm going to ask that she unmute herself. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, Catrina. It was a great talk. Thank you so much again. So my question is more of a curiosity question. As far as the domestic threats from these ultra-right groups or ultra-left groups are concerned, you mentioned about a vast data set that you have. Do you have any insights in the spread of their education level or income level, or has anybody looked at it?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't have that data available. And to some extent, a lot of that information may not be available just in terms of reliance on publicly available information on the perpetrators. I think that's something that would be interesting to look into. I would flag, especially on the sort of socioeconomic level, that there's been a good body of research looking at the fact that sort of lower socioeconomic status does not correlate to extremist activity and terrorist activity. So I definitely commend you to look at that. In terms of getting deeper into personal characteristics, there are definitely some characteristics that I think as we continue to build out this data set, we're really interested in looking at, even looking at more basic factors like gender. That's easier to track based on public records. I should mention, not only we have the locations where these events have taken place, including geographic coordinates, So we've also done some analysis just looking at the geographic spread of these events, and interestingly have found that they really are distributed across the country, not just focused in one particular region, not just focused in cities as opposed to rural areas. So I think that there is definitely a lot of room for expansion of the analysis and of the characteristics we're looking at. But one of the other things that we think is really important, if I can just go back to the recommendations here at the end, in terms of urging the government, and particularly when starting to look at issues of extremism in law enforcement and the military, urging the government to collect and analyze this data, is that a lot of these organizations have a lot better access to this information, particularly, FBI or DOJ as they're prosecuting these cases and investigating these cases, the military in terms of having access to service records and discharge records. A lot of this information is available somewhere, but it's not currently shared and compiled in one place. And it's not currently being analyzed in the context of preventing domestic extremism. And we think that being able to pull this together, obviously with requisite privacy concerns, especially as we're starting to get into more of that personal data, and accepting that some of that data would not be appropriate to make publicly available, being able to do that sort of centralized data analysis on who the people are who are committing these attacks will help us to be better prepared to counter attacks in the future and to disrupt radicalization pathways.
Great. Thank you so much.
So I have a couple of questions, and I might ask one or two of them. I think we're wrapping up on time. So if there's anybody who has a question, feel free to raise your hand. I'll ask two questions, and I'll let you pick whichever one you want to do, because I'm interested in both of them. So the first question is, you sort of brought up the hate crimes against Asians and Asian Americans that we've seen a rise in. And I guess one of my questions is this distinction between the hate crime and terrorism, because individually it might be a hate crime, but it exists within some broader framework that is terrorism due to like sort of the let's say political language that might be going on, right? That sort of there is this terrorist push, but as it boils down and disseminates to individual actors, it becomes more of a hate crime. The other questions, I'll give you the choice. I think I'm sort of interested in this idea of how do we build a framework for reporting that isn't, how can I put it? Doesn't come with punishment, I guess, right? So, and the way that I'm sort of thinking about it in my mind, or say punishment or maybe overreach is, for me, I think when we talk about jokes and comments people make, sometimes it's a bit easier, let's say, to say some comment was sexual harassment or completely inappropriate, but then we have language that might just be viewed as political, right? And so I guess, how do we even build a framework for measuring these things to say, hey, okay, that was just an inappropriate joke versus we see this consistent, I guess bad language or whatever you want to call it that might be associated with terrorist beliefs and extremist beliefs. So pick your question and we'll go from there.
I'll try to really briefly hit on both of them. We're hitting time here. On the second one, in terms of reporting, I think that that's something that can really be built out starting from the unit level when we're talking about the military, and looking at, the military already has a lot of great processes in place for, support for troops and for counseling. And so just really, I'm not sure where exactly you draw the lines. And I think a lot of discussion is ongoing about that within the Pentagon. But I think that if you're able to create a structure where it's not just, cut and dry, black and white, you said something that concerns someone and now you're in disciplinary procedures. Yeah. If there's really an open dialogue about it, and an open dialogue that it's not just that we're, policing everything you think and say, and then we're going to kick you out of the military because of it, but it's that we're trying to build a culture that is representative of America. We're trying to build a culture that can keep America safe by ensuring that we don't have the forces that are threatening America start to infect our troops. And so the sort of thing where the assumption, if you report something or if you're reported, isn't, okay, I'm immediately going to be brought up on some kind of high-level disciplinary procedure, but, maybe I just, sit down for a coffee with my commander and talk through, what happened, what my perspective was on it, and just really have a more empathetic means to countering the situation, because any kind of counter-extremism effort, especially looking at more lower level infractions, should be aiming not only to create an environment free of extremism, but to create empathetic off-ramps for individuals who are radicalizing or at heightened risk of radicalization. It's not just that we want to identify individuals that we've categorized as in the process of radicalizing and banish them from society. We really want to come in with an empathetic approach to educate people and to allow them to, steer away from extremist influences. And then very briefly on the first question, on the overlap with hate crimes, I think it's just a matter of, seeing events as possibly being both. There's, the statutes around domestic terrorism are fairly weak. Things are typically prosecuted as the crimes that they are, rather than through, deep domestic terrorism legislation. And so I think it's just a matter of thinking about hate crimes as an overlapping subset of some terrorism. So some terrorism is a hate crime, but not all terrorism is a hate crime, and not all hate crimes are terrorism. But for instance, terrorism that is targeting individuals based on their race, their ethnicity, their religion, their identity, if they're part of the LGBTQ community, anything like that can very quickly verge into the hate crime territory. So if you have an attacker who's going out and, the Pulse nightclub shooting, for instance, or the bombing of AME churches, or throwing Molotov cocktails into a mosque, all of those things overlap into both categories, because you're both targeting individuals based on their identity, and you're making this broader socio-political statement, instilling fear using violence.
Alrighty. Thank you so much, Catrina. Wonderful presentation. Really enjoyed the Q&A, and I'm sure many of the audience did as well. With that, I want to close off our series this semester. And I want to encourage anybody, if you're a researcher or you work with an NGO or the government, or you live somewhere in the space and you're interested in presenting, or you know someone or can think of somebody who we should get to come present, feel free to send me an email, and let's get in touch. For everyone, my email is adan.vela@ucf.edu. And we look forward to many more great seminar talks. And we look forward to everybody being able to join us later on this summer, and definitely in the fall. So with that, thank you very much, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you again, Catrina.
Thank you all.